so many aspects and causes us to go so many directions at such breakneck speed that by the time we get to Christmas Day, it's extremely hard to figure out what it was all about. How many of you all, over the couple of 3 weeks before Christmas, as you were riding home some evening, or maybe you just made a special trip, went out just to look at Christmas lights and see the pretty decorations? Several of you did. Several of you did. And those decorations included all sorts of things. Garden Ridge and Lowe's and Home Depot make it very difficult for me to keep my money in my pocket during Christmas because I love inflatables. And I love knickknacks out in the front that light up. And I like gizmos that move back and forth. And Amy will tell you, should I tell what my nickname is?
Oh, I think most of them already.
Most of you already know that I'm the Christmas moron. And I just like anything that is joyful and exciting and gets me moving in any kind of direction. But in driving around and even in pulling into our parking lot and driveway, you see a lot of manger scenes. And we didn't have a manger scene. What sets us apart from so many churches is the wonderful, wonderful Advent wreath that we offer to our friends in Midtown as our gift to them with the candles. And believe me, folks, I had plenty of comments, and the people loved it. But as we look at all of the decorations, if you see most of the decorations somewhere in there, we are going to encounter a number of nativity scenes. But now we're almost 2 weeks past Christmas. And one question may be worth asking ourselves, not me asking you, but we need to ask ourselves, how well did all of these depictions of the birth of the Christ child, how well did those depictions help us in understanding what all of the hoopla meant? You know, we get caught up in Macy's ads, and the one-day sale is going to be tomorrow. And then there'll be another one next week, and another one the week after that. But we get caught up in the hoopla, and I look on my telephone to see where I've got a coupon from so I can run to Bed Bath & Beyond and I can get 30% off because I've got a coupon on my telephone. I know none of you all do that, but it does happen. Well, we got to get past that if we're to understand what Christmas really was about. And we need to listen to modern theologians. And I have problems sometimes listening to modern theologians that remind us that the two major gospel accounts of the birth of Jesus Christ are totally different, aren't they? Totally different. Luke tells us one thing that went on. Matthew tells us another thing that went on. Where in the Bible do we have two totally different accounts of something happening that's just right together? Who knows? Thank you, ma'am. Genesis 1 and 2. You know, we've got two separate accounts of the creation story. Both of them are valid. We have two separate accounts of the birth of Christ. Both of them are valid, particularly if you will read a commentary or two, or just put your gray matter, not hair, but what's inside, to work and look at the timeline that Luke starts his story, his narrative, at the very beginning. Matthew's story takes place somewhere 2 years after the birth. And it's Matthew's story that we're looking at. And what we have done is we've taken both stories and we've combined them. Because if you look at a creche, a nativity scene, you're going to have the infant Jesus, You're going to probably have an angel. You're going to have a few animals. You're going to have a couple of kings. Well, there is no biblical basis for having it all in one. But over the years, we as human beings have taken the two stories and we put it into one nice, feel-good story, and we see a nativity scene with the child in the center and all of the trappings that come from both Luke and Matthew combined. And there's just no biblical account that justifies this interpretation. But there is a lot we can learn, a great deal, from putting the stories together as we do, or reading them individually as we do. First thing we learn is the connection between Christ, the King of the Jews, and his oh so humble beginnings. He was significant because he was a different kind of king. He was not the king that the Jewish people expected when the Messiah came. And then from our gospel reading this morning, the effort that even those wise men put into finding the Christ child. John alluded to it. John, you took half. John, wherever you are. That bothers me when whoever's over there. That John alluded to. Do you know, you realize, don't you, that the wise men got lost? That the GPS that they were following was about 12 miles off. Is 12 miles 18 kilometers, John? Okay. They were about, the GPS was 12 miles off, and they had to ask directions. Now, we're not going to have any jokes about men asking directions. I don't even want to hear that. But maybe that's why they were wise, is they did ask for directions where they were going, and they followed the directions, and we see how the wise men responded as we go through. I found an interesting story that was just written a couple of weeks ago, and it's about Christmas 2012. The story comes from an Australian minister whose name is Moira Laidlaw, and how her church wanted to build a beautiful creche in the front of their church, just like we had the Advent wreath, and how it worked. Hear her story. A church on the corner of a busy road in Sydney, this is her describing her church, had lots of cars passing each day, so it was decided to erect an Australian nativity scene outside where everyone could see it. The woodwork and art classes of a nearby high school made life-size figures. The shepherds were transformed into Australian drovers, and the scene included a couple of sheep and a horse and a dog. The stable was made of corrugated tin, and there was a large sign fixed front and center that said, "Peace." The manger, Floyd Scarberry probably would have made, the manger was made of sturdy timber, and in it a baby doll was placed on some fresh straw. It looked good, and it was certainly eye-catching. The first thing that was stolen was one of the sheep. The second thing that was stolen was the peace sign. And then finally, the doll that represented Jesus disappeared during the night. So another doll was found, and it was duly installed in the manger. And the next day, the preacher, got to church, and that doll was gone, and it had been replaced by a 2-liter Coke bottle. A handyman who was doing odd jobs in a nearby block of units was so angry that he said if someone would provide another doll, he would fix it so that it couldn't disappear. Well, he certainly did. The minister, Moira Laidlaw, couldn't believe her eyes when she went out to see what he had done. He had nailed a piece of timber across the manger. And then he had nailed the doll, symbolic of Jesus, to this piece of wood. Now, with the straw and everything arranged around the doll, the wood and the timbers and everything could not be seen and all you could see was the dog. "There you are," the carpenter said proudly. "He'll be able to stay forever now." Well, think about what would have happened if Jesus had stayed forever in that manger. Where would we be? And think about how difficult it is for me, and it is for you, to let that child out of the manger and into our lives. Because when Jesus comes into our lives, there's going to be disruption. There's a mismatch in the typical nativity tableau, for lack of a better term. There's a mismatch with the peace that we see there and the real world. In the days leading up to Christmas, we have found a familiarity. Oh, it's so familiar and warming to sing Christmas carols and familiar remembrances and memories with our family and friends and images of that first Christmas long ago. But once Christmas is over and the new year arrives, sometimes it's very hard put. Sometimes I'm very hard put to remember how impacted I was by that Christ child who came into my life, and how I tend to think, oops, one-day sale at Macy's. I think I got to go there and can't do the things that I need to do. And unfortunately, each Christmas has its harsh realities. Here in our country, we had a major catastrophe in Connecticut with those children being killed. In the South Pacific, we may not have gotten much news about it. There were horrible, horrible hurricanes and much loss of life in Samoa and in Fiji. Think about the headlines you read about civil war in Syria. And think about all of the violent unrest that is going on right now in Egypt. It's difficult with the headlines in the newspaper screaming at us with violence and all that goes on. It's difficult to equate that with a picture of the Prince of Peace there in the Holy Land. I don't mean to say that when we read of those things that are happening, that we don't need to connect Jesus to them in our reactions and in our actions, but it's difficult. And when we respond to the horrible things we see in the paper, we need to respond with wisdom. We need to respond with thought, so that as Christians, our response is appropriate. Our response is dictated to by that child in the manger, who was not nailed in there like the one in Australia, but who came and who entered our hearts. And that brings us to the three wise men, the Magi. The scholars, and John's already given you the background, that the scholars that followed that star from Persia, probably, they were followers probably of the religion of Zoroastrianism, and they were probably astrologers. Now, I do not read my horoscope every day. Some days I do, if I happen to be flipping through. I do not go and buy a lottery ticket based on what it says, nor do I play numbers that are come in fortune cookies on a lottery ticket. I don't do lottery tickets. I don't think it's wrong. I just don't do them because I'm too cheap. But these wise men set out not because they really knew that Jesus was the Christ, not because they knew that he was the Messiah. They set out because that star in their knowledge was symbolic, because always when there were births of dignitaries and great men, a star disrupted the normal sky and appeared where that great person was being born. The other thing is, the wise men were not Jewish.